Well, it's Monday morning. Monday morning of a new week, and I gotta say, it's been a couple days since I've been here, and I always miss it when I don't come here. I miss it, which might probably sound strange, but the reason I miss it is because of the vulnerability, the vulnerableness. This may sound strange, but without the vulnerableness, I don't know. It's so easy to fall back into patterns, and I don't think I am falling back into patterns. But the problem is, until I come here and practice my vulnerability, I can never be sure, because I find that the feeling of it, the sense of it, is because it's such an active and ongoing thing that I if I'm not continuing it, I mean, I it's easy to just slip into thinking again. It's easy to, and that's very subtle. It's a very subtle piece, and I've been. I mean, every day, I try to watch, listen, and partake of some kind of spiritual dialogue, and I feel it's important because, I mean, our lives are literally the content that we create and interact with, and unless we make time and space for the things that are important to us, then they're not important to us. It makes me think of Gandhi's book, Experiments with Truth. You should really read that book. It's a great book because Gandhi was quite a being, and I mean, you don't need me to tell you that. But anyway, his book, Experiments of Truth, were basically his accounting of how he was faced with challenges to his Hindu faith in the health of his children. And in his stories, the stories that have stayed with me, because I read the book like 20 maybe 25 years ago, in that range. That's about 25 years ago, I would say. And I mean, it still has the resonance inside me, because of course, when I read the book, I was in the process of entering a family situation, so care for children. How much I was willing to do to support my daughter, to read Gandhi, it had an impact on me. It still does. And so anyway, my point is, for him, he's in India there, in the Christ was in the 30s or the 40s, or maybe Africa, because he spent time in Africa as well as India. He was in South Africa and Africa before he became an activist in India. Anyway, his children, he said, they'd get illnesses, tropical illnesses, and his doctor was a Muslim. And, when you're weak, you need to build up strength inside the body. And so the doctor, being a Muslim, would always recommend beef tea, like a beef stock, a beef consomme, like a bone broth, essentially. It was one of his recommendations to build the strength up in his children. And in these moments, Gandhi was faced with a challenge to his Hinduism, because, of course, no meat eating in Hinduism, and in particular, no beef, because cows are sacred. And which is another thing I find interesting, but I'll put a pin in that for now. So here he is, the doctor saying your child might die unless you let them eat this bone broth made of animals, made of cows. And so Gandhi was like, well, I cannot do that, because if I give my children beef tea and they survive or they prosper and flourish, I am invalidating my Hindu faith. And so rather than follow the doctor's advice, he chose to use traditional Vedic remedies. And in each case, he found that his children recovered, and it reinforced his not just his faith, his knowledge of Vedism in his life. And so at the time, I'd have these conversations with my then partner, because we had a daughter together, and for her, that experiments of truth was the proof why she should be a vegetarian. She was a vegetarian. I was not. I am not. And so even on the top, like, we never agreed about anything, which is another story. But for her, it was an argument for Hinduism. For me, it was, I feel, the argument to say, whatever you hold to be true, you must live it. You must bring it into your reality. Because if you're not, it's nothing more than an empty idea, and it's meaningless, and you should immediately discard it. Experiments with truth. You must experiment with your truth. You must live your truth. Otherwise, it's not truth. How we live is the manifestation of our truths. And so that was a hugely influential moment for me, because I knew I'd give my child the bone broth. I'd give them the bone broth tea. That's what I would do. But then the lengths I would go to support my child led me to trouble in my life, because I didn't have any love within. I had love for others, but not love for myself. And so I was willing to sacrifice myself, getting into nonsense and never being a realized person, to support my daughter, And although I don't have regrets as a parent, I mean, I did my best. No one's perfect. I'm not saying I was a perfect parent, but I did everything I could. And in those dark days of my life, and let me tell you, the 20 years of her life prior to her, being a grown-up and going on her own way and whatnot, those, the best and most true times of my life were being her dad and being a parent. That's where I discovered my best self. And I always remember there was an element where, while I was with her in all the moments of our parent-child relationship, I was also trundling along this undernourished child inside me that was never raised. And so being with her, I was actually with two children. I was with her, the real child, and then I was also with a part of myself that had been neglected, and actually in some ways a bit actively abused, but more just neglected and misunderstood and not cultivated inside myself. And so there was this process inside myself when I was a parent of also being there in my own failed childhood, ultimately. So anyway, that was definitely an important phase of my life. And Gandhi, as an influential figure, teacher, being, he was important at that time, because in my 20s, I started to explore the Carlos Castaneda, and I was taking in these attributes of warriorship, and I was evolving in a certain way, but I was evolving from the wrong premise, from a loveless inner wasteland premise. So of course my life was an outer wasteland, and all I was doing was trying to survive in this wasteland. And that's what my life was surviving in a wasteland. But the wasteland is what I created. And so periodically I'd come to these points where I couldn't go any further with Castaneda. And one of the key pieces in my late 20s, when I had to put Castaneda down and just back away, it was basically the topic of inorganic beings. And the way that Don Juan, as a shaman practitioner, viewed the world. And so I can remember at the time I was doing a lot of psychedelics because I was trying to break through, and I would break through and then slip back in because I could never quite tap the wellspring, And so doing a lot of psychedelics, late 20s, university, it was in some ways the best time of my life, and yet I was on a trajectory for just, more suffering, it seems. But at one point, this is going to sound funny, but at one point, Don Juan is making fun of Carlos because they're out there in the wilderness in Mexico, and Carlos is worried about diarrhea. He doesn't want to eat something that's going to give him diarrhea, and like Montezuma's Revenge, basically, right? And so Don Juan is laughing at him. He's like, you're so worried. It's like you're afraid. Diarrhea is out there in the environment somewhere, stalking you, and you're doing everything you can to avoid being hunted and captured by diarrhea, in essence, right? And Carlos goes into his explanation. Oh, diarrhea, it's an inner process. Amoebas get in your guts, blah, 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 right? And Don Juan says, well, it's just because it's the tonal of your time to believe that everything is happening inside of you. He said, instead, the tonal of the sorcerer, the shaman sorcerer, is to believe that everything is outside. And so for Carlos, of course, diarrhea is an inner process. And in our culture, of course, you take the Pepto-Bismol, trying to alleviate it. We do know that it is something from the environment that gets inside of us, But for Don Juan, the whole focus is it's something out there. It's a force external to us that affects us. And so there's this impasse between the two of them that Carlos really did a good job at showing, right? But that freaked the ever-loving shit out of me, because suddenly, for me, it was all psychological process, all inward, right? Suddenly, in one moment, I had this aha moment where I realized that we were also in a world of unfathomable mystery on the outside, you see. Because up to that point, I'd suffered from this terrible abstraction. My inner life, my solitude had been poisoned, quite literally, by all the traumas and things that had happened to me, so that even in my solitude, I was never actually at peace. I was never coming from a place of loving relaxation and being. I was always in a place of negative thinking about myself. Always. It was like the preset that I couldn't break through. And so as a result, I mentioned this the other day, when I talk about Alan Watts, now he recognized the experience of traumatic, tension-inducing abuse from the environment, which in culture is a kind of fixed state inside, right? For him, it happened in school. But for me, I never made it to school because I was so brutalized by my home environment that school was way out there. I just never involved myself in school. And all my teachers on all the report cards, all the way up until I was in high school, when other things started happening, they were always like, well, there's more in there. We know he's smart. We can participate. He's just not doing anything. We got to find a way. Every report card was the same thing, because I couldn't even approach school because I couldn't be myself at home either. There was no place where I belonged. So, and at home is where I lived. So I could barely cope with that environment. School was just never an option, right? So here I am in my late 20s, trapped in this abstraction, taking all these psychedelics, trying to break free of it, right? In an unconscious urge, which is to say my urge to be a seeker was pulling me in that direction. And yet I just couldn't make the connections, right? And then the light bulb went on that it's not just things that are going on inside of myself psychologically. It's also this world of infinite possibility on the outside, and the idea that things that I thought were inside and therefore under my control, because again, where the fixed conditioning really fucks with us is we think we're in control. Oh, we're in control. I'm okay. I can pretend I'm okay, and as long as I've got this control, I'm going to be all right, And that's the illusion. That's the lie that I was living. But then to realize that my sense of control might have nothing to do with the process because it's coming from the outside, it scared the bejesus out of me, to be quite frank. And it scared me so bad that in my psychedelic experiences, I began to have these weird perceptions, often auditory, I guess hallucinations. And by hallucinations, I began hearing things. I began hearing things that frightened the shit out of me. And I realized I wasn't right. I didn't know what I was doing. And by the way, as what I've learned later, I believe that is what the experience of Anahata chakra is. Anahata is the unstruck sound. It is a process of evolution where if you begin hearing things, in the world of spiritual reality begins coming alive for you, and what you need to survive that process is absolutely clear distinction in your psychological process and sweetness of emotion. Sweetness of emotion. That's the only way you can cope with anahata, which is a phase of spiritual development, unstruck sound. Because if you don't have this, if you don't have the discernment, you don't know what's real and what's false. And if you don't have the sweetness of emotion, that's really the peace which allows you to be at peace at all. Otherwise, you're in a state of inner torment without sweetness of emotion, I mean. And then whatever materializes for you is going to be the manifestation of that negative place. And so at that moment, I think I was in a psychological crisis. And I do believe, actually, that many of our mental health clients in our system, that is the experience they have. They come to a place where, like, for whatever reason, whether it's some kind of inborn high energy intensity that's driving them, whether it's drug experiences that are driving them, they come to a place where they begin perceiving things outside of the norm, and they don't have that clearness of perception, nor do they have sweetness of emotion, because paranoia, that depressive element, the negative qualities of mental illness, it just creates a nightmare scenario, and they don't know what's real and what's not. And then something breaks inside of them, injury happens, and then they're locked in hell, basically, in hell. And by hell, I'm not talking about Christian hell. I'm just talking about hell as radical unpleasantness, paranoia, depression, fear, mistrust. The list will go on and on and on, right? And so, for me, that was my experience. I was living in Vancouver at the time, having these weird auditory experiences that made me almost breathlessly afraid. And so at that time, there's a part of me, I don't know, there's a part of me that when the information comes in, I don't know, I've always been able to make the right decisions, and in that moment, I was like, I've got to stop this, I've got to stop all of my substance using, I'm going to stop everything and regroup. Actually moved back to Victoria. I put a distance between those experiences and myself. And that is when I read Gandhi's book, Experiments with Truth. And this is one of these moments where Carlos had taken me as far as he could, because at that moment I was so stuck inside that I couldn't go any further with what he was saying, because the idea being a world of spirits, a world of inorganic beings, a world where everything was outside of yourself and they're out of control. Whatever you think of as inside of you is actually coming from outside. It just did a number on my sense of safety, and I wasn't safe, and I was really in a bad place. And Gandhi's Experiments of Truth helped me deeply, because, and also at that time I was reading J. Krishnamurti, another guy you should read. J. Krishnamurti. Hard to really put him in a box, because he's a spiritual teacher out of India. He's coming in the early part of the 20th century, and he's kind of like I would say he's kind of like a guru character, because he didn't espouse any system. He didn't talk about meditation. He talked about truth and being, and I found his words and his presence in his words and his writing to just be the antidote for the kind of intense ideation that was happening in me, because that was really the problem. Because I didn't have the proper discernment, because I didn't have the sweetness of emotion, I couldn't handle this expanding situation. So I would say in my late 20s, if I'd been in a different state, perhaps that's when I would have come to the place I am now. As it was, I was still too broken, still too stuck, couldn't do anything about it. And so I had to retreat from what I was learning in my process of Castaneda. And then I found J. Krishnamurti, and I found Gandhi, and this set me on a different path. I also, at that time, I had my daughter was born, and I started going into a family kind of experience, and I felt a really strong pull towards it. It's something in the family experience I needed. That was a deep dive right there, but it's an important one, because I've introduced themes that I'm interested in talking about today. And I'll be right back.